Today, the world recognizes slavery as a crime against humanity. For over a century and a half, we've fought this evil collectively. But that wasn't always the case. While modern slavery remains a massive issue, 99% of the global population now agrees it's wrong. Just a few generations ago, that consensus didn't exist. History rarely comes down to the work of just one person. Many rallied to this cause over decades. But few movements have ever had a figurehead as clear as William Wilberforce. His heart for Christ transformed the world, and his opposition to slavery literally reshaped an empire. This is the story of Wilberforce's war. It's the story of how a broken heart became a rallying cry. One man's faith changed everything. London's favorite socialite was once a man named William Wilberforce. A famous singing voice and a seat in Parliament made this young man a legend. But behind the wit and the jokes, an emptiness began to grow. Everything changed in 1785 during a long trip across Europe. He spent months studying the Bible with a scientist named Isaac Milner. Those ancient words hit the politician's soul like a physical blow. Radical submission to Christ replaced his desire for popularity. History knows this moment as his Great Change. Wilberforce carved two specific goals into his diary. One, to fix the morals of the country. The other, the total destruction of the slave trade. Believing God had saved him for this exact purpose, he got to work. But success required more than just passion. The movement found its base in a quiet suburb called Clapham. A circle of wealthy, influential Christians formed there. They weren't just praying, they were planning a revolution. Opponents sneered at them, calling them the Clapham sect. But these were the most powerful people in Britain, bankers, thinkers, and members of Parliament. While the world mocked, they plotted. They turned a fringe religious idea into a political weapon. The system they targeted was a global giant, fueled by gold and human misery. The battle lines were drawn, and the men in power were ready to ruin anyone who stood in their way. For Wilberforce, doing the right thing was a form of worship. He was convinced that no country could truly prosper while built on a sin. In his eyes, stealing a person made in God's image was a direct violation of divine law. This conviction put him at odds with London's elite. In the early 1800s, sugar was as valuable as oil is today. The West India interest, yet a powerful lobby of wealthy investors, protected those profits with deep pockets and bought votes. Their message was a threat. End the trade, and the nation collapses. Wilberforce saw it differently. He saw a spiritual debt that had to be paid regardless of the cost. He believed God's law sat higher than the stock market. By 1833, after 46 years of fighting, the final victory was finally in sight. Parliament prepared to vote on the Slavery Abolition Act. To get the law signed, the government agreed to pay £20 million to compensate the owners, a massive bribe paid to criminals while the victims received nothing but their freedom. But to the saints, freedom was the only prize that mattered. To pay that debt, the government took out a loan so massive that British taxpayers only finished paying it off in 2015. For 181 years, everyday citizens paid for a choice made in the 1800s. It was a complicated victory. Parliament had voted to save its soul and nearly bankrupt the nation. The cost was staggering, but signing a paper in London was only the beginning. A law in England meant nothing to a criminal at sea. Wilberforce believed a nation that loves God must protect the weak, and that required a fleet. Under his pressure, the government created the West Africa Squadron. These sailors were the long arm of Wilberforce's conscience. They patrolled 3,000 miles of coastline. Their mission had a face. One was a 12-year-old boy named Samuel Crowther, forced onto a slave ship and later rescued by the Royal Navy. Samuel's life became a living testimony. He eventually became a bishop, proving the change that Wilberforce had fought for. But the mission was deadly. Malaria and yellow fever killed more sailors than combat. One sailor died for every 9 people they freed. To tighten the net, the Navy introduced the Equipment Clause. Previously, they could only seize a ship if victims were on board, which led some captains to throw people overboard to avoid capture. The new rule allowed the Navy to seize a ship just for carrying slaving gear, like oversized cooking pots. Over several decades, they captured 1,600 vessels and liberated 150,000 people. The tide was turning. This naval crusade reached its absolute peak in the years following the 1833 Act. By the 1840s, the mission was consuming a massive portion of the nation's entire wealth. We often think of slavery as a strictly American story, but it is a global phenomenon. In fact, the word slave comes from Slav, referring to the massive number of Eastern Europeans enslaved in the past. While Wilberforce fought in the Atlantic, a different ancient trade lived in North Africa. Some historians estimate more Europeans were enslaved there than Africans were sent to the Americas. This was a global darkness, until now. Britain took the fight worldwide, using Wilberforce's moral arguments to pressure rulers in Egypt. In 1877, they signed the Anglo-Egyptian Slave Trade Convention. Britain established manumission bureaus in cities like Cairo. An enslaved person could walk in, ask for a certificate of freedom, and become legally free under British protection. In 1894, the arrest of a top leader, Ali Pasha Sharif, for buying enslaved women proved that no one was above the new law. The gospel was breaking chains in every corner of the earth. Some saw it as noble, others saw a grab for power. But for those walking out of those offices with their lives in their own hands, the motive didn't matter. A new global order was rising. In 1926, the final domino fell in Geneva. One man's faith was now global law, the League of Nations Slavery Convention. For the first time, a global body officially outlawed slavery. The treaty was inspired by the work Wilberforce started a century earlier. It proved a moral standard could exist above kings or presidents. But to see the heart of this victory, we have to look back to 1833. Wilberforce lay dying as the news broke that the Abolition Act had passed. Wilberforce lived just long enough to know the battle was won. 3 days later, he passed away. Convictions held by a small group had shifted the axis of history. The results proved his vision. Changing the law was only part of it. The very value of a human life had been redefined. Ultimately, this work pointed back to the freedom found in Christ. The debt Britain took on was heavy, but it was a down payment on a world where freedom is the standard. Every human rights treaty today can trace its roots back to a room in 1785. Faith had won, and when put into action, it still has the power to break chains across the globe.